Joining me this week is Tom Murray. Tom serves as the Director of Innovation for Future Ready Schools, which is a project of the All for Ed group. He also serves as a regular conference keynote presenter. He was also named one of the 20 to watch by the NSBA. In 2015, Tom was named Education Policy Person of the Year by the Academy of Arts and Sciences, and in 2017, Tom was named Education Thought Leader of the Year. His best-selling ASCD book called Learning Transformed was released in 2017, and his latest book, something we're going to focus on today, Personal and Authentic, was released at the end of 2019. So Tom clearly has had a very influential career, and certainly more to come from Tom. So Tom, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
What an honor it is to be. I was actually thinking maybe you were out of guests, and that's why I got the invite. Maybe that was it. But no, in all seriousness, love your work. Appreciate you, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, Tom, it's great to have you here, and certainly I appreciate the fact that I did not run out of guests for sure. You are certainly a welcome someone I've been thinking about having on the podcast for quite a while now, because I've been quite familiar with you. Full disclosure, you and I have never met face to face until today. Quite familiar with your work through Twitter. As we were chatting before, we joined Twitter right around a month apart. You were June of 2009. I was July of 2009. So in the early days of Twitter, we've never met face to face, but certainly I've watched as a follower of your work, your influence grow. And we share a mutual friend, Ken Williams. I know is one of your very close friends, and certainly Ken is a friend of mine and a colleague. So really excited to have you here, Tom. And I want to jump right in and start with your journey, because I'd love for listeners to get a sense of the beginnings and how you became this thought leader. So before we dig into the substance and content of our conversation, let's start with the arc of your career. So highlight for us, Tom, the journey, the professional biography, if you will, maybe highlighting specifically some of those impact points that led to you becoming this internationally recognized thought leader in education.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And, diving in and reflecting on 20 plus years of just the work. And I go back to being 21 years old, fresh out of college, thinking I had a clue is what I was getting myself into. I went to Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and I started pre-med. I thought I wanted to be a pediatrician. I'd always loved working with kids. Growing up in high school, I had done a lot of summer camps, liked being around children, recognized the innocence, recognized the impact, went to college being pre-med, thinking that's what I wanted to do. I did it for a year, loved it, did pretty well. But there was a part of me that always said, I don't want to just see kids when they're sick. I want to really make an impact. So I switched over to education. I start my career, suburban school outside of Philadelphia as a fourth grade teacher, 21 years old again. That door closes on that first day. And I can remember the thought being like, oh my gosh, where's my cooperating teacher? This is really the show now. What am I going to do? And here's the thing, Tom, I would love to tell you how that first year was great and things went well. And I've just got better as a teacher and things progressed. And in retrospect, there has been such significant impacts from other people throughout my career that have helped me really guide me to where the work that I'm doing today. My first year teaching, I tell the full story in Personal and Authentic in chapter 1, fundamentally changed who I was, not just as an educator, but myself as a person. I share the loss of a mentor, somebody that loved me enough to kind of whack me upside the head when my mindset was off. When, as that first year teacher, I started to use a lot more words like me, my, and I, as opposed to we, our, and they, that loved me enough to call me out man to man. But there was some tragedies that happened that year that really gave me a different lens to step back to say, why do I really do this work? If I got into this to make that impact, why am I so looking in the mirror saying, well, this isn't fair for me. When are we gonna have the time to do that? And it fundamentally changed my lens in what this work was really about. And I really believe this work is about loving and caring about kids first and foremost, and everything else comes secondary to that. So having some tragedies occur, the loss of my mentor and some other things that I share in Personal and Authentic, really changed my mindset and lens as to what this was about to be. I love teaching, and there I was as an elementary teacher early on. I also had this passion for technology. Now, I laugh when I think about it, because going back to the early 2000s, I'm talking this was like the era of the Palm Pilots. And by the way, I was one-to-one in my classroom 20 some odd years ago, Palm Pilots, right? And so we think about some of these tools and some of those pieces, but I enjoyed doing that. So I actually went to middle school and I taught 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, got to do some things around technology, really enjoyed that. But I had another mentor walk into my classroom one day, and there I was. I had 2 master's degrees. I was kind of the top of that pay scale from a teacher end, in terms of credits and that kind of stuff. And a mentor walked in my classroom one day and said, Tom, I've got about 3 years left in this building, and I'd love to see you running it when I leave. And he walked back out. And I remember thinking, well, I really look up to him. I really admire him. I like that leadership side of things, but it was a mentor that really
Yeah.
pushed me, because I don't know, had he not done that, I might still be teaching in that middle school classroom. So I had a
Mhm.
mentor that really pushed me to do that. Finished my principal certification. Little did I know, somebody else was retiring, pulls me in, I get an administrative opportunity. So I serve at the middle level, moved down to serve at the elementary level, was there for a number of years, loved it, being an elementary principal, one of the greatest jobs on the planet. Move over to district office when my superintendent said, hey, I've got a growth opportunity for you. I go and I take that on. We were doing amazing things too. Things I look back, 13 years ago, completely competency based K to 12. We created our own virtual program, taught by our own teachers with our own curriculum. I'm talking 13 years ago. So we were very progressive in some of the things that we did. And I then get this call. We were featured on Digital Learning Day, which is now something that I help run. And Digital Learning Day is run by All for Ed. And again, going back about 11 years ago now, it was 10 years ago. It was the second Digital Learning Day. My team was featured because we were creating here you go, it's going to sound familiar, our own virtual program taught by our teachers with our content, and then offering kids the flexibility at the high school level to kind of really come in and to leave this campus per se, like almost that college feel, with any combination of face-to-face and virtual classes. And we did that for 3 years. And I would say it took us about 3 years to really get it right, and got recruited to go to Washington, D.C. In a bipartisan way. So part of my work, I get to work with the U.S. Senate, the Congress, sometimes the White House. And I'm not there to be red. I'm not there to be blue. I'm there to really focus on student-related issues that we really believe in. But that's
Yeah.
where that was birthplace of Future Ready Schools. And so I've been doing that for the last 7 years, working with superintendents, working with principals and whatnot. So, in retrospect, it's every step of the way, I've had people whose shoulders that I get to stand on because of
Right.
encouragement, because of mentorship,
Mhm.
but also the opportunity. I feel really blessed to do the work that I do to influence students nationwide.
No, you are certainly having an influence, no question, and it's the technology side, of course, that allowed me to become familiar with your work over the last decade or so, as you expanded your reach, and that became evident on Twitter, that you were having more and more influence, and you could see the teachers interacting with your work. Certainly impressive stuff, Tom, for sure. So let's move to this overarching view, and we're going to get a little bit more granular and specific in a moment, but let's look at this from a view from 30,000 feet. So quite simply, what does it mean to educate students to be future ready? What does that mean to you? And what does that mean to us in terms of our focus on being future ready and having our students being future ready?
Yeah, so I really like to phrase that as, how do we empower students to live life on their own terms? How do we create the conditions where they can thrive, no matter their abilities that they walk in with, that they can leverage their interests, their passions, their strengths, so that their experience is far more learner centered in nature. And so this notion of future ready, as I'm talking about, also goes hand in hand with my thoughts in personal and authentic. So the work we do at Future Ready Schools is meant to be very learner centered, right? How do we create the conditions where every student can thrive, no matter where they come from, no matter the zip code they call home? And so when we look at that at Future Ready Schools, we've created a framework to really support, a very evidence-based framework, the key areas of transformation in schools. And I will tell you, first of all, like a kudos to the educators across the country who are working tirelessly to support kids, especially when they don't have the funding they need or the resources they need, especially leading throughout this pandemic and all the work that they've been doing. But at Future Ready Schools, we've created a framework to look at some of these big bucket areas of transformation. In other words, the areas that are foundational when it comes to shifting our schools to create the environments that our kids need. So to answer your question directly, on a student end, how do we create the experience where they're crossing that graduation stage, ready to live life on their own terms, ready to follow their interests, their passions, their strengths, where we've equipped them enough with the skills for life, right? And that's far deeper than sometimes we look at it. Sometimes I think in a K-12 system, we look at walking across that graduation stage as, let's check them off the box. They graduated, we did our jobs, nice work. Where in retrospect, like, that's really just the beginning, right? And so
Right.
how are we giving them the foundation to be able to live those life on their own terms? And referencing Future Ready, I'd encourage to listeners here to check out futureready.org, bipartisan nonprofit. We don't sell anything. We do a lot of research and taking a look at a lot of different areas for transformation, but then we also really work with school leadership to make it happen. So I'll give you just a really quick, again, 30,000 foot view. In
Sure.
working with school and district leadership, on the outside of the framework is this notion of collaborative leadership. Leadership's not by title. We really look at it as all by action. And when I look back on my own career, I think about some of the best school leaders I've ever worked with. And sometimes that was the support staff member making a few dollars an hour above minimum wage, yet was a backbone to our building, constantly stepping up. Maybe it was that third year teacher that was just crushing it for kids and breaking down walls and really influencing the lives of others and creating the conditions where kids were comfortable and safe and really given the opportunities to be who they wanted to be. Or maybe it was that 35-year veteran, right? Who it was her last year, but she was teaching like it was going to be her best year because she recognized that those students only time in 7th grade or what have you. When we look at the Future Ready framework, let me just quickly talk about some of the components of the key areas that we have to make sure as we shift the systems moving forward that we don't lose sight of, that we keep front and center. First being curriculum instruction and assessment. Our job is not to come in from a Future Ready end and say, like, here's the curriculum you should purchase. We look at that as this notion of how do we make sure the experience for students is relevant and for today's modern learners. We can all relate to this notion of kids asking, why are we learning this? Why are we learning this? And we've all heard it. Every educator's heard that. To me, it's a sign of one or two things. Number one, maybe we need to step back and really analyze some of the things that we do and ask, is this the best way? Is this relevant for today's generation? But number two, it really helps us reflect on what we do systemically as well. And maybe it is just a really good question, or they don't see the relevance to it. And if they're asking that, sometimes they can't make the connection to why we're doing it, right? And everything we know about learning, that connection needs to be there. So the curriculum instruction assessment end is helping schools and districts and leaders to really be progressive in thinking about the experience themselves to make sure that it's relevant for today. The next piece is the personalized professional learning. And I will tell you, we don't call it professional development. We're not mad at folks that do. But if you look at any study on the phrase professional development, what do people think of? Sit and get, hours-based accountability, kind of one size fits all. Now, the good thing is we've seen such a shift in the system over the last 5 to 6 years and recognizing, districts recognizing what some of the best professional learning looks like, coaching, side by side, peer to peer, in each other's classrooms, those types of things. But recognizing how do we create a system where we're practicing what we're preaching? If we're talking about personalized learning for kids, yet everything we do for our adults is one size fits all, it's hypocritical. Like, there's no other way to put it. And so how do we mirror what we're saying is good for kids with our staff? And also, how do we empower our staff? Tom, you and I are both people that we work with districts. We do a lot of professional learning ourselves with district leaders, and we're really proud of that. But at the same time, some of the greatest people doing professional learning are teaching in classrooms every single day and helping districts really enable that. Third piece is around budget and resources and taking a look at sustainability. Could go on and on about that one. Here in the United States, we've got the funding that's come from the federal government around COVID. And we're going to see a fiscal cliff in a couple of years if we're not careful. And so we want to take a look at how do we maximize funds, recognizing every dollar we spend comes out of somebody's pocket somewhere. So sustainability is really a key there. Just to touch on the other ones very quickly, community partnerships. How do we connect with our businesses, places of worship, and recognize when we say our kids, it's our community's kids. And how do we connect? We see a lot of great things happening at high schools with pathways and where they're leaving high school, graduating sometimes with an associate degree or certificate to be able to do things in the world of work that they're interested in. Lots of great stuff happening there. Data and privacy. I had the opportunity to testify in front of Congress a couple of years ago in that area. And we talk about it from a Future Ready end. Privacy is a non-negotiable. How do we make sure that the information that we have and that we're collecting, we're doing what we need to do in that area? Robust infrastructure, really the technology side, that's on campus and off campus, something we saw really come front and center in the pandemic. And finally, the last one being the use of space and time. When we look at the use of space, that's learning spaces. And we're not talking about being pretty for Pinterest here. It's really how design impacts the brain and learning. And then the use of time is, time's that one of the only constants we have in education. And so how can we use time differently? And we see that often when we look at more mastery-based approaches and ways that people are using time differently. So I think to answer that question fully, those are some of the big bucket areas that we focus on. But as districts and schools want to transform into those that really can create those future ready conditions for students, those are some of the areas that we have to really look at evidence-based approaches to shift the system while not leaving any of those out so it doesn't all come crashing down.
Yeah. It's such a thorough framework, and I really appreciated what I really appreciated about the framework was that focus on budget allocation and financial decisions, because as we know, the financial decisions we make, the budget allocations we make, actually express our values and what matters to us, and where we put our money where our mouths are. And when we do that, we really can back up the assertions we're trying to make about having our students be future ready, the use of space, the idea of the infrastructure. I think we're going to touch on that a little bit more later on, about the infrastructure and some things that happened during the pandemic. But you make me think about this idea of being a citizen, being ready for citizenship, and how can they be a future ready, productive citizen in our society. And I want to unpack this notion a little bit with you, because I think it creates a bit of a dilemma at times for public school systems. And this is where I want to go. Like, where is the line between a personalized education system and what society as a whole wants or desires from a public school system? So here's what I mean by this. The public, being in society, a publicly funded school system, has at least some say in what the collective outcomes of a public education system would be. If public education is supposed to be the great equalizer, then we have to make sure it is that. Now, you assert that our job is to ensure that each student graduates from high school with the agency, the passion, and the skills to be a productive, compassionate, and responsible citizen. But my question would be, who defines what a responsible citizen is? Is it up to the individual to decide that? Is it up to the teacher? Is it up to the school? Is it up to the state or the province that funds the system? Where is the line between the individual's desires and passions and what is in the best interest of the greater good in society? So who gets to make that decision, or how is that decision made?
Wow. So first of all, I mean, what a question. Second of all, do we have a half a
Sorry.
day for this podcast to really dive into? Third, I would say, have you seen any school board meetings on YouTube in the last number of months here in the United States? Because what you're really getting to is like, who makes the call? Who has the final say? What right do parents have? What should you be teaching on certain topics? Should you not? Should you need to avoid certain topics? Like, this comes up when we see things around like banning books. And, you see that big thing in Texas right now. Your schools
Right.
cannot use these. Well, like, why is that case? Like, who can say yes, who can say no, and where is it? Will we make it available, and where's the parent right? I look at Iowa right now. They're going on something that in their legislature where teachers have to process this lesson plans and
Yeah.
materials online a year in advance. Like, by the way, what does current events look like for that section when you do that,
Yeah.
right? Like, so many facets to that. And it really is about control and who gets that control. And you see that
Mhm.
playing out, the whole CRT conversation at school board meetings,
Right.
like, yes, you're
Right.
teaching it. No, we're not. Right. So number one, what you're asking is really around this hot button issue of who has that final say, who has control. And I think there's multiple ways to look at it.
All right.
At the states, we're very local control based. And so what you were
Mhm.
saying, I agree with, where people do have a say, because at its foundation, you vote for school board members. School board members, now, they really aren't there to choose the curriculum. When you look at why
No.
school boards are there, they're hiring the superintendent, they're setting policy and setting budgets. Now, watching them overarch into curricular areas has been fascinating in the last number of years, because there are
Mhm.
folks, to be honest, that are saying, I want to say, now I'm on the board, I'm going to have a say, so I'm going to dictate the type of grading system that we can have. We don't
Right.
want to go to this over here because our kids aren't guinea pigs. Like, how many times have we heard that, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so really, really boiling it down to who has control. To me, I step back and look at it from a public school end, because in reality, there's other options out there.
Of
I'm a
course.
person of faith, and if I wanted it to be the main driving force in everything for my students, it's a big, or my students, my own children, it's a big part of their lives. But personally, I choose to send them to public school. No, there's
Mhm.
areas, if I wanted to go down a particular path that wasn't necessarily appropriate for public school, like, I would have that option as a parent to send them elsewhere. And so part of it is this wrestling between, where's the parent say, where's the community say? The difficulty is, what's the reality look like? If when I was that middle school principal having 1,200 kids, it's not feasible to say, here's my 1,200 different curriculums because my parents want 1,200 different things. Like, you can't do that. So going to your note, what's really for the public good? And so when I step back, really fundamentally, public school systems are there to help support, in my opinion, the democracy on hand, to educate the common good, to have the skills for the workforce, to have the skills and let's even broach this topic of like integrity. How do you teach that? What does that look like? Where does the
Right.
moral compass come from? Who has the say on those pieces? And so for me, I think part of it really needs to be this notion notion of here's what we're doing for our community because it's what we believe in. Now, I think there's some variance there. I was recording something the other day with a superintendent of a very rural district in California. They have a very agrarian, everything they have there is people working in fields, lots of workers that are coming in. It's a very high need population that they work the field, but they're going to create some environments that give kids some skills to be able to thrive in their environment, where if I'm in Center City, Philadelphia, that program, those things there might not be so relevant. And so on one hand, we want some of that control to say, here's what's going to be best for our community. The danger comes in, many school boards, 5-person boards, you get people that run for kind of the wrong reason for their little issue. They can overarch and over dictate. Working with a lot of superintendents, one of the struggles is some superintendents can be, and again, when we look at this notion of being superintendents, they really, in one night, one vote, they can be out. And so as they push and to transform and push to move, they've got this constant battle of, if they're not bringing their board with them, they can only move so far and do so much. So to answer your question, it's going to really depend on that local control area, at least the way it's structured in the United States. And so, I think on one hand, I encourage parents, I encourage students to use their voice to share things. So it really is upon the district to seek parent feedback. When you're looking at a new math program, whatever it might be, you need to engage the community because it's their students. And I think the due diligence is to hear the voices, hear the conversations, hear the arguments on all sides of things, make sure that we're taking student voice at hand and we're really promoting that, right? If this notion of agency, which you read in one of our definitions, to give students the voice to be able to do the things they want to do, they need to be in that. And so where districts get themselves in trouble is they don't seek that parent input. They don't really partner with them. They don't ask for student input. And let's be real, at times, not even asking for teacher input, kind of here's what we're doing at the level. And then that's a whole other issue there as well.
That's, for sure.
And so for me, it's how do you create this system where we're including parents, including students, including our teacher expertise and experience as part of that, to make the overall curriculum decision that's best for the community as a whole. Now, that's going to rest with the administration there with passage for budget ends, because a school board can say no. A school board can say we're not spending $200,000 on that new curriculum. They can have that choice. They can be that roadblock if they don't believe in it. But there also needs to be some checks and balances, and whether that's with the school board, whether that's with because if we can look at it with best intent, saying, well, yeah, we want them making those decisions, and that's all well and good, and we do. But let's face it, if we have somebody that's got the wrong mindset in a position to say, hey, we're going to do things that aren't good for kids, there also needs to be some voice in communities, in our students, from our teachers to say, hey, we don't believe in that. That's not part of our core values. So I love your question because it's so complex. It's so deep in nature. It's so relevant for the world that we're living in, whereas people really wrestle with that control. In the best places that I see it happening, here's what I see. I see superintendents and principals that are community builders. And you recognize when you're making decisions, you're very rarely going to have 100% of your people on board, right? Especially if there's a shift, especially if there's a change, because we're asking people to do things differently. So in places where we see superintendents and we see principals being community builders, leveraging the expertise of teachers and the educators, leveraging student voice in the process, engaging our businesses, going back to that community partnerships gear of the framework, building this community, building collaboration to say, here's what we want for our students. Let me give you one example. I'm thinking about Valverde Unified in California. Superintendent Mike McCormick is a great friend of mine. They've grown their Pathways program from 4 or 5 years ago, 3 or 4 pathways at their high school, to now having over 40 pathways. But here's what they did. They went into their community and pulled in many of their business owners. And we've got business owner contact information. It's on our tax rolls, and reached out to them and said, we as a district have your next 20,000 employees. What do you need for our community? What are the skills you need? What are the certifications you need so you don't have to rehire? If we've got all of your employees, work with us to get it there. And they've created some of the most robust pathways where they're partnering with businesses, partnering with communities, and parents are on board because they're, on the whole, because they're recognizing you're giving our kids skills that when they can leave us, they're going into the workforce, getting some jobs if they didn't want to go to that 4-year college, whatever it might be. Maybe they do, and they have a new skill set as well. And so I think being a community builder in this area is really important, making sure we do have the voice of other people. If it's constantly in us versus them, you're going to get massive turnover from an administration and probably from our teachers teachers as well. And everything is going to move so slowly because it's going to be this consistent battle.
Yeah.
So, depending on the issue, it's really hard to say like that line is at the
Right.
30-yard line or whatever it might be. But we're going to make sure that we're community builders to make sure that we can really leverage the voice, because at the end of the day, it is the community's kids. Our parents should have a say, but we can also have to be realistic about, we've got 1,200 kids in a school. We also have to do what's good for the common good. And
Right. Right.
so lots, we could go on and on about that.
I
Love
bet
that,
we could.
but really, really interesting challenge there.
Yeah, for sure. I think sometimes when we're operating out of the extremes or operating from the view of the caricature, it's never a productive place to be. So, for example, when we talk about personalized learning and somebody says, oh, does that mean there's 1,200 individualized learning plans? No, it doesn't. And it's never meant that. When we talked about personalized learning, that's the caricature of what people try to say or try to use. Just like you would say, well, there are curricular standards that students have to reach. Well, then the caricature is this dystopian society where everybody's just compliant. And, we use those extremes and those caricatures to try to assert a position, and yet they're never the truth. And finding that balance, I think, is really important. You also made me think of something, Tom. I wonder sometimes about the balance, not just between the self and the community. I wonder about the balance between the future and now. What I mean by that is, can we, or how do we avoid being too future focused that the school loses sight of who's in front of me today? I am a young adolescent when I'm 13. I am not an adult, and I have certain needs that the school should be attentive to as a middle school student, for example. How do we strike that balance between constantly having one eye on the future or both eyes on the future and making sure that we are not overextending and therefore being dismissive of where the learner is today?
Wow, brilliant question. I absolutely love that. So I want to answer that through the lens of having a second grader, right?
Okay.
So when we think about it, if everything that I said to my second grader was like, when you're in the workforce someday, you're going to have to, he's 8. Part of him is like, I want to play Minecraft today, right? And
That's
so
right.
let's be totally real with the problem with also always being future focused is you can lose sight of contentment in the moment. And
Mhm.
so one of the things that we've seen in the pandemic is also this focus on mindfulness, even happiness. I'm a big fan of like Sean Akers' work and really looking at like internal happiness and how can we present in the moment, right?
Mhm.
And so I think part of it is, yeah, we need to make sure we're not missing now. Like part of it is, as districts, we encourage them to have a vision. Where do you want teaching and learning to be 5 years from now? That's a really relevant question. But if my kid is a high school junior, I care about what you're doing right now, because 5 years from now, they're not going to be here anymore. Right. And so
Exactly.
it is this balance of, we can't give up contentment. We can't give up, appreciating the moment, also
Mhm.
recognizing the amazing things that we are doing. Right. And so
Yeah.
I think even, and we look at, and I've talked to, how many times have I said transformation or something already, or being future
Right.
ready? But in the same sense, let's also celebrate the greatness that's happening, and many times has happened for a long, long time in our classrooms. We can't lose sight of that as well. And I think we do
Mhm.
have to appreciate those moments. And part of that, I think, is to pause and reflect and to recognize what are those things that are going on right now that are really good, or even looking at the pandemic. What are some of
Mhm.
the things that we've shifted, whether it's instructionally or whatever it might be, we should hold on to, because maybe, hey, we were forced to
Right.
do it a different way, but there's some value there, right? And I think
Right.
celebrating in those moments, but I also think keeping your focus on your people, right? The work is about
Mhm.
people. It's with people and for people. And so if we're only thinking about where we want things kind of long term, we can really lose sight of those moments. And we recognize that every interaction matters. Every day is an opportunity. And so I think when we keep that front and center, whether it's that personal contentment that we're talking about, it's the
Mhm.
celebration of students and the things that they've done, it's the recognizing greatness that has been in our schools that we don't want to change, and being content in some of those moments, but then
Mhm.
also moving forward and recognizing what are the areas that we can continue to stay relevant for society. It's kind of
Right.
like driving. When I get in the car
Yeah.
in a given day, if I were to drive from my office to back home, there's times I'll take slightly different directions. I want an idea where that end goal is. Otherwise, I'm just driving in circles, in circles all
Right.
night.
Right.
But at the same time, I'm going to use the interactions that are there. I might go slightly different directions based on
Mhm.
that feedback in the moment. And I think it's an analogy of, we need that vision. Otherwise, people are going to get really frustrated. Why are we changing this? Why are we doing this? And
Right.
without that vision, without people understanding it, that frustration absolutely ensues. But we
Mhm.
also need to have the flexibility and agility to say, hey, what we're doing today I'm going to shift this in the classroom instructionally to really ultimately do what's best for kids. And we recognize just it's why we can't keep every lesson plan the same every single year, because who
Mhm.
we're serving is changing. And so that flexibility and agility today recognizes who's sitting in front of us today is really important, but
Yeah.
simultaneously keep working towards that where we do want to be long term.
Yeah, and I think you can have, both eyes on both. I don't think it's a binary choice that you're either attentive to today or the future, but I do think it's important to be mindful of who is in front of you and where they are, because they will be different when they get into the workforce and they are adults. You mentioned the pandemic, so I want to slightly shift to that and just ask you, from your perspective, did the pandemic kind of expose how future ready some schools are not?
Yeah, 100%. Absolutely. And it's been really interesting to work with superintendents, for a good
Yeah.
7 years pre-pandemic. So let me give you an example, and it's a front and center for all of us here around home access. Future Ready is an equity focused organization. And when we look at it, we've been talking about students that haven't had home access at every workshop, every institute, virtually every session that we've done. And when we look at it, there's been a number of districts that over time have said, yeah, when statistics pre-pandemic in the United States were showing us about 70% of our teachers were asking kids to do something digital outside of school. But in our latest research in the pandemic early on, we did a state by state breakdown of how many kids didn't. And in the United States, it was about 16.9 million children.
Wow.
Disproportionately, it was our Black and brown students that didn't
Yeah, of
have
course.
needed home access. So when we take a step back and we look at, number one, we knew the need was there. Number two, like, why did it take March 13th of 2020, which was the date for many districts, that
Right.
Friday, being
Yeah.
like, oh shoot, now what are we going to do? And so when we take a look from a Future Ready end, many districts have come and said, thank you for really pushing us on that, because we were equipped with some of the devices. Many of our students that didn't have access had some of the hotspots. And again,
Mhm.
it's brought something front and center. I really like to share that in my opinion, like, COVID didn't create equity issues. It amplified equity issues that have always existed. And so
Right.
when we look at things like that, when we look at kids, some of those initial thoughts, if we go back to that week in March of 2020, I didn't hear a single educator saying like, oh, darn, the spelling test for next Wednesday, we're going to have to put off that first week. It was,
Mhm.
do my kids have food? Do my kids have what they need?
Yeah.
Are they safe? And really going back to those essential foundations of making sure people have what people need to be
Mhm.
safe and to be able to come to learn. And so what have we seen? We saw, the federal government in the United States step in and say, we're going to provide free lunch for every child across the board and breakfast if needed, because we need to level that playing field. We
Mhm.
saw the influx of technology to be able to support off campus. We saw those needs because it really went back to the fundamental needs around opportunity and access. And
Yeah.
so to answer that question, when we look from a Future Ready end, there were a lot of districts that made a lot of investments in those things pre-pandemic, right? But there was also some districts, if I'm totally honest, that said, oh boy, I guess we really do need to care about this. And I do say that in a loving way, but we have to look at our lens and say, why were we blind to recognizing how many of our students didn't have access, yet we were constantly asking them to do something they couldn't? And then how many
Mhm.
times did it impact their grade? How many
Right.
times I've never met a high school junior that wants to put their hand up and be like, I didn't put that in whatever Schoology Google Classroom last night because I didn't have the access, because right now I'm living in a homeless shelter or at a hotel or whatever. You know, it's typically what I've often seen, if we're putting students in that situation, it's often that kind of shame and that quiet. And then sometimes now we're deducting points from a grade. And
Right.
so I think it's forced us to take a really hard look at those kinds of things. It's
Yeah.
forced us to take a look at things around grading and instruction and asynchronous learning. In the United States, our Congress has used this notion of a learning loss. And you want to talk about a hot topic, people get all
Yeah.
fired up, looking at that. On one
Yep.
hand, I look at it like my own son, he missed in-person learning half of his kindergarten year and almost his whole first grade year. So there's a part to it when we look at like reading and writing that, like, you know, across the board, there was a lot of need there if they just didn't have as much in-person time. Now, I want to follow
Mhm.
that up with to say kudos to the teachers who did everything possible to do things virtual. But I get, look, put like 25, 30 virtual kindergartners on a Zoom, like realistically, you're kind of limited in how long you can do stuff, how much you can get
Right.
across. So I think it's really brought to light some of those instructional pieces to help us focus
Hmm.
on, like, what does high quality instruction look like? What is value virtually? What might that look like for some kids, if not all kids? And what could
Hmm.
that be? And really is bringing us back to even things around, some of the questions around grading and engagement and what
Yeah,
should that
for
look
sure.
like? So
For
I think
sure.
if anything, it has been a crisis. We'd certainly never look to want to go through that, but it's brought up some essential questions around some of these key areas, whether it's access, opportunity, whether it's grading and instruction, that if we don't look at it now and we don't make shifts now that we know are good for kids, let's be real, we're never going to do it. Like,
Right.
if we don't do that now with the influx of funding, with the opportunity to say, hey, we've looked at this is different, when we get back to a comfort zone, wherever that may be, hopefully sooner rather than later, just in terms of pandemic stuff, like, we're not
Hmm.
going to make the shifts then. And
Right.
so we do see a lot of districts making those shifts in those different areas. But yeah, going back to, I think districts that were heavily involved in Future Ready, we were talking about a lot of this stuff, and bam, the
Hmm.
pandemic hit. Fortunately, a lot of them had gotten ahead of it. A lot of districts had,
Right.
but the reality was it slapped us in the face a little bit to say, hey, we weren't prepared for a number of places, and they need to face that realization and now actually do something about it.
Yeah, for sure. You know, from an infrastructure perspective, a lot of districts were caught, and I think that the past practice had been, let's wait until we find out whether or not someone doesn't have access or a family is struggling with that. And I think the lesson out of that is that we have to go get that information.
Yep.
We have to find it out, because, as you say, they're not going to volunteer that information out of embarrassment, or
Yep.
they don't want to put themselves in that vulnerable position. And then I think you're also spot on with the idea of pedagogically, assessment wise, instruction wise, there were a lot of conversations that got put off, that the pandemic kind of pulled back the curtain and said, you need to talk about these things. And because what was happening was, so many kids were being given assignments or things that were easy to copy. They were, sort of recalled. Now, look, you got to give it to teachers. In those first few months, the pandemic, everyone was kind of in shock and awe. So, those early stages, I think everybody can be forgiven. But as the dust settled a little bit on the routine of remote learning, I think a lot of conversations were really important. And I also have to hand it to districts, because a lot of districts, even though they got caught with the situation around infrastructure and students not having access, so many of them stepped up and really made sure that access to internet, et cetera, high speed internet, was available to them. So I think that while this is not, I don't think you're intending it this way either, that this is not meant to be a criticism of educators or the systems. It's just meant to say, these conversations that began as a result of this pandemic, we have to continue having those conversations and continue to refine
Absolutely.
where we are and all of that. So I want to finish up here by talking about relationships, because I know that you talk a lot, and everyone in education talks about this. Is another one of those things where we all know relationships matter. We teach human beings, we don't teach widgets, so we know these are people and they have emotions, and we develop relationships. And yet, when you ask the question, build relationships, or what does that look like, that could take on many different forms for people, right? For some people it's about never hurting their feelings, or some people it's about tough love, or whatever it is. So from your perspective, Tom, what does an authentic, sort of real relationship look like between a teacher and a student?
Yeah, I love that question. So to back it up a little bit, I shared earlier, I really believe our work is about loving and caring about kids, and everything else is secondary to
Hmm.
that. It is one of the things we have going for us in public education is that law mandates they show up.
Right.
So to process, like, if it didn't, would they still come? And so in many, many places, I would say the answer is absolutely, right? And why
Hmm.
is that? I would like to go on record and say, like, I don't think it's because standard 1.2.4b is really exciting that day. I think it's
Right.
because we're creating opportunities, showing that belief in them. And so to dive into that, how do we foster relationships? I also think, to your point, we have to call, like, what does a high quality relationship look like? And it's
Mhm.
also about high expectations and accountability. And I
Right.
think sometimes when we look at that, I think it's easy for people to say, well, I don't want to be that teacher because I have high standards in my classroom and they're going to learn here. It's not going to be a party every day. And it really gets
Mhm.
to a mindset problem about what they think relationships is, and also a control issue as to who's in control and what the real purpose is. But when we
Yeah.
really look at it, when students are walking into classrooms, it's that I can think back to that old adage of, like, don't smile until Thanksgiving, which is probably some of the dumbest advice somebody could give a
Yeah.
new teacher. here in that regard. Because how do we create an environment where kids want to be? How do we create an environment in recognizing every interactions matter? So I want to actually back it up before I mention the classroom level to the
Sure.
admin level. I've never met a superintendent or a principal that doesn't preach relationships. And so one of my challenges for them is that's all well and good. And we all know that. How do you model it?
Right.
Because when I think about sometimes when I ran faculty meetings, if I'm telling my teachers, hey, you need to build relationships with that student. Hey, you've got that one behavior issue in there. We'll just build a relationship with them. But then at a faculty meeting, I'm never prioritizing any time for relationship building. I'm asking my teachers to do something that I'm not showing that I value. As
Right.
opposed to one of my challenges in getting to work with and coach a lot of principals is like, what might be the impact if the first 5 minutes of every single faculty meeting was some sort of team building, culture building, fun, something that just recognizes the human side of the work? And sometimes I'll throw that out there and I'll get a little pushback, but Tom, we only have 60 minutes a month. And I'll lovingly push back and say, okay, Len, can we outline your priorities? Because if
Yeah.
it's not people at the top, we've really got to question why that's going to be. But any research on when students feel believed in, when they feel part of something, where they want to be somewhere, academically, it's going to be much higher than if a student's walking into an environment of fear, if they're walking into an environment where everything is like, I'm just going to take things away. And in those environments, from a research end, first of all, I think it's really important to look at. But second of all, just look at your own life when you
Hmm.
connect with people. And I don't care if it's when you go to church, I don't care if it's at that VFW, I don't care wherever that might be, the people you plug into outside, why do you choose to do it? It's the human interaction, and our brains are wired for that human interaction. Our brains are wired to want to be part of a group. Even if I'm an introvert, I want to have that sense of belonging. So, from a
Right.
classroom end, how do we create the sense of belonging from a neuroscience end so that they can be there? And it's recognizing the differences in our students as strengths, not as needs. It's so easy in our world in education to come at it with this deficit mindset, especially when
Right.
we look at data. And I'm a fan of data, but we have to do it in context of the individual story. I like to call it the hidden stories within. And so when we look
Hmm.
at creating these relationships, how do we get to know each student on a personal level where we know where they care about, but then on a more global level at a school? One of the things I wrote in Personal and Authentic, I thought it was a brilliant story out of, I believe, Nevada. And I told the story from an article that I saw where what they did was they took every single student in their building and they put their name in a faculty meeting all around the room where they had every student identified. And then they had columns. One of them was, I know that student by name and face. Like I recognize who they are. Another
Hmm.
one was, I can talk a little about their academics. And then another column was, I can talk about things they like or enjoy outside of school, things that they're involved with, church or baseball, whatever it might be. And then they took every single staff member. I'm talking every custodian, every kitchen staff member, secretary, and they gave them all permanent markers to walk around the room and place check marks next to every student in ways of where they could say that they recognize them, they know them by name, they know their. And guess what happened? The vast number of students were recognized by name and our face, and that was really it.
That was it.
And there was this huge group of students that really become snapshots of pictures walking through our halls. So, how do we get to know them, who they are, what they like, what takes them on an emotional roller coaster? How do we get to know some of the hidden stories within? To me, it
Hmm.
also really comes down to trust. And to me, relationships really come down to trust. And so, how do we build trust with our students? How do we build those relationships and build trust with our parents who send us their most precious commodities every single day? Our parents send us the best they can each and every day. And how can we build trust there? Without it, relationships really are the foundation of learning. But it also comes with high expectations. It also comes with the conversations of, I know you can do more. And I'm going to push on you because I know you can get more out of them. That also is that relationship to continue to push, to continue to grow, but to love them at the same time.
Yeah, you talk about time and attention with teachers and students. You talk about time. Time is the currency,
Yeah.
and through that currency, we get receipts. So a leader who does not invest in relationships is not getting any. You're talking the talk, but you're not walking the walk. And I've said for years that from a student perspective, I've always said that what adults give their attention to is what children eventually come to know as important. And you could say the same thing about leaders. What a superintendent or a principal gives their attention to is what the faculty or the principals will come to believe is important. And as a principal, you don't not have time to invest in relationships with the people you work with to develop that connection and that shared kind of responsibility with the work. Getting to know learners, even high school students, yes, teachers have 120, 150 kids on their roster. Can you know them as learners? Can you understand some of the idiosyncrasies of when they're in your science class or when they're in your just in your classroom or whatever experience you're having? Tom, I feel like I could talk to you for another 3 hours about all of this stuff. I mean, I love the conversation we had, but we are going to finish up here. So we'll have to do a part B at some point down the road. 2 questions left as we finish up, and these are questions I ask everyone who comes on the podcast. And here's the first one, and you can take both of these questions in any direction you'd like to. But the first one is this: educationally speaking, and I kind of think I know where you're going to go with this, but educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
Oh, I can answer that right away, and I can tell you my answer has shifted over time. When I was a teacher, when I was a principal, I would stare at the ceiling, worried about my kids. I would worry about some of the connections. I would worry about some of the home lives. I'd worry about some of the poverty. But being that I don't work hand in hand with students every day anymore, at least the same group of students, what keeps me up right now, it's the mental health of educators, where educators are taking care of people all day long. Many of them go home and take care of people at night, and they get up the next day and they do it, and they get up the next day and they do it. And they spend so much time taking care of other people with servant hearts and loving on other people that they run over themselves in the process. And that notion of self-care is not selfless. And so what keeps me up at night is the mental health of educators. And I do worry about that.
Yeah, we are constantly giving to others. Listeners, you might recall from October, my conversation with Tina Bogren, same thing. Nurses and teachers are the caregivers, as she puts it. And the research indicates that we often put ourselves last. And we have to find a balance, because it is about the students, but it's also about our mental well-being and our physical health as well, so that we're there for our students and are able to fully support them that way. Okay, last question. I really do appreciate that answer, Tom. Last question as we finish up, and this is more of a personal question than it is a professional question, but the two will blend, of course. But it's a question about success. And if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what's your definition of success, how would you answer them?
To be a little bit better tomorrow than I was today. Just the notion of continuous growth, continuous improvement, recognizing that everybody's point A is different. So getting to point B is going to look different, but just being a little bit better tomorrow than I was today.
Yeah, I think in the micro level, just instead of thinking about this grandiose definition of success, just can I be better than I was yesterday? Can I be better tomorrow? It's often an adage that a lot of athletes take, right? Just getting better each day. Just what can I be a little bit better at? So I love that. Listeners, there are no shortage of ways that you can connect with Tom. Tom, of course, as I've mentioned, is on Twitter. The handle is at Thomas C. Murray. Instagram, Thomas C. Murray EDU. You'll find Tom on Facebook. That again is at Thomas C. Murray EDU on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, Thomas C. Murray, at Thomas C. Murray on LinkedIn. You get the notion and the pattern here. Just search Thomas C. Murray and you'll find Tom in all of these different places, as well as the Thomas C. Murray website. That's www.thomascmurray.com. Also the Future Ready website. I'll have links for all of these in the show notes, listeners, if you want to connect with Tom on multiple places. And also on the website, there's lots of opportunities to connect with Tom. Should you want Tom to come and speak to principals or speak to your district or work with teachers, lots of opportunity to do that. Tom, it was great to meet you. I certainly was a very insightful conversation. I really appreciated the conversation with you today. Thanks for doing this, man. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity. Glad to be here.